Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the new season of the Theory from the Margins lecture series. My name is Patrick Brock. I am a research fellow at the University of Oslo, speaking to you from Salvador, Brazil, and I'll be moderating today's session. This is our final webinar of the year. Before we move on to introducing today's speaker, I would like to say a few words about who we are and what we do. The Theory from the Margins Collective deep reads on current scholarship on postcolonial theory, the decolonial turn, and theory building from the global south. The collective reads works from marginalized communities in the global north and south, as well as critical interventions based on in-depth studies of marginalized groups. Theory from the Margins is primarily interested in the contemporary global academia's engagement with what we understand to be theory, and it aims to spark broader discussions about the theoretical concepts outside of academia. I am joined today by my colleague, Dr. Merv de Boer from the University of Utrecht and the University of Oslo, and by research fellow Thiang Theron from the Norwegian School of Theology. Without further ado, I will now leave the floor to Merv to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Patrick. I'd like to welcome our speaker for today. I'm Dr. Waïl Hassan, who is a professor of comparative literature and English and the director of the Center for South Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He specializes in modern Arabic and Arab diaspora literature and intellectual history, and has written extensively on the uses and limits of postcolonial theory for studying literatures from the global south. Hassan is the author of Tayyib Saleh, Ideology and the Craft of Fiction, Immigrant Narratives, Orientalism, and Cultural Translation in Arab American and Arab British Literature, and a forthcoming book entitled Arab Brazil, Fictions of Tertiary Orientalism. Hassan is the Arabic to English translator of Abdel Fattah Glito's Thou Shalt Not Speak My Language, and the Portuguese to Arabic translator of Alberto Musa's Lughz al-Qaf. He has also edited several books and special issues, including the Oxford Handbook of Arab Novelistic Traditions, Approaches Teaching the Works of Naguib Mahfouz, and Literatura e Imigração no Brasil. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And also a special issue on Arab Latin America, if I'm not wrong. Waïl Hassan is a past president of the American Comparative Literature Association. So without further ado, I leave the floor to you, Waïl. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to your lecture.
Thank you very much, Merv, for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you all, and thank you so much, Patrick and Thiang, also for your participation and your assistance with this session. So basically, I mean, my paper asks or tries to think of an answer to a simple question, which is, can a non-Eurocentric comparative literature be imagined? Historically and epistemologically, comparative literature began and has largely remained a subset of European studies. The very idea of comparison and the very ideas of comparison and literature have a well-known 19th century provenance that is invested in nationalism, scientific positivism, and geopolitical rivalry, manifested in nation and empire-building projects. The comparative literature of old was all about Europe, France, Germany, and England in particular, plus Renaissance Italy and Spain. Forays of the discipline into other parts of the world in recent decades have, for the most part, been undertaken from a firmly European base. Postcolonial studies put a new twist on this centrality as a critique of colonial representation, discourse, and epistemology. Postcolonial studies could not do without the centrality of the West, as its name indicates, of course, if only in the form of a reverse Eurocentrism. To signify this paradoxical reversal, while acknowledging its invaluable contribution, I have elsewhere described the postcolonial approach to comparative studies as the North-South paradigm, and called attention to the no less paradoxical admission of previously excluded literatures into the sphere of comparison at the cost of tying them to colonial history and metropolitan canons. The fact that literatures written in colonial languages, such as English and French, have claimed the lion's share of scholarly attention in postcolonial studies, or that world English and Francophonie have enormously revitalized English and French departments, at least in American universities, is no accident. A shift in perspective from Eurocentric paradigms, including the vertical north-south axis, to interregional or cross-regional south-south relations can, in principle, bypass the centrality of colonial and post-colonial relations and their monolingual spheres, the Anglophone, the Francophone, the Hispanophone, and the Lusophone, to advance the project of decolonizing knowledge. This is not an argument for displacing the postcolonial, something that is neither possible nor desirable, but for opening a space for a trans-regional approach to the literatures of the Global South that draws on the philological and polyglot resources of comparative literature while disavowing Eurocentrism. From a methodological perspective, the focus on South-South relations allows us to move from a postcolonial to a decolonial reading practice that questions the epistemological foundations of comparative literature. To unpack this idea, I would like to focus on the example of Arab-Latin American relations and to reiterate some well-known facts worth repeating here because of the novelty, especially in a North American or a Western European context, of examining the relations between two global South regions. First, Arabs have had a long time with the a long relationship with the Americas. The culture of that Spanish and Portuguese colonists brought to the Americas was deeply marked by nearly 8 centuries of Arab, Moorish, Muslim presence in Iberia, with incalculable impacts on language, literature, philosophy, architecture, music, cuisine, and so many aspects of Iberian culture, not to mention the ethnic and racial makeup of the population. Some of the earliest slave narratives in the Americas were written in Arabic by literate Muslim captives from West Africa. Influential intellectuals like Cuban José Martí and Brazilian Gilberto Freire recognized the Arab, Moorish, and Islamic role in the formation of Latin American cultures. Large-scale Arab immigration to the Americas began in the 19th century, late 19th century. And those immigrants and their descendants have become prominent in numerous spheres of public life in Latin America, becoming heads of state, prominent politicians and businessmen, captains of industry, famous professionals, intellectuals, and writers. Various diplomatic initiatives, from the Tricontinental Conference of 1966 to the Latin American Arab Summits of the 2000s, have recognized the geopolitical importance of historical and cultural ties between the two regions. And not least, like other parts of the Global South, the two regions continue to confront the trials of colonial modernity. So all of these ties furnish ample grounds for comparison between Arabic and the literatures of the former Portuguese and Spanish colonies in the Americas. Second, the conceptual paradigms used to define the study of the two regions are not only Eurocentric, but also colonial. This becomes clear when we recall how the names of that area studies assigns to the two regions came about. Walter Mignolo explains in his book, The Idea of Latin America, that the term Latin America originates in colonial geopolitics. He writes that the concept of Latinidad was used in France by intellectuals and state officers to take the lead in Europe among the configuration of nations involved in the Americas, those being Italy, Spain, Portugal, and France itself, and allowed it to also to confront the United States' continuing expansion toward the South, as in the purchase of Louisiana from Napoleon and its appropriation of vast swaths of territory from Mexico. White, Creole, and Mestizo elites, according to Mignolo, after independence from Spain, adopted Latinidad to create their own post-colonial identity. So the continental divide posited by Latinity was thus less geological than geopolitical. It was drawn not between the land masses of North and South America, but along the lines of French imperial interests, between an Anglo-Saxon Protestant America and a Catholic America for which France served as the ideal in politics and literary culture. Latinity came to refer to an educated civil society in America that turned its face to France and its back to Spain and Portugal. And in this way, French imperial interests coincided with those of post-colonial officials and intellectuals in former Portuguese and Spanish colonies. And the construct of Latinity thus bequeathed to those elites the sense of radical difference from an antipathy toward Anglo-Saxon America, on the one hand, and at the same time, on the other hand, it erased indigenous African and Asian heterogeneity in Latin American societies. So this is as far as Latin America is concerned. More explicitly, the term Middle East and its variants, Near East and Far East, refer to relative distance from Europe. The term Middle East was coined in 1902 by American naval strategist Alfred Thayer Mahan in the context of British imperial competition with the Russian Empire to refer to the region from the Persian Gulf to India, which he considered to be of strategic importance as a unit distinct from what he called the Near East, which referred to Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, and also from the Far East or East Asia. So a shift occurred but a shift occurred in the lead up to the Second World War, when British military commands were combined under the name the Middle East Command, based in Cairo. And since then, what used to be called the Near East became the Middle East. Neither cultural nor historical, the term Middle East emerged in the theater of British military operations, then was enshrined in US foreign policy after the war. It was not until after the war, the Second World War, that the same area was recast as a cultural and historical region. Right? So North Africa, East Africa, Southeastern Europe, Greece, Cyprus, and Central Asia sometimes do, and at other times do not belong to the Middle East, depending on the perspective of the speaker and their sense of strategic interests. The term Middle East is also historically variable in a number of ways. Sometimes it functions as a chronotype that includes medieval Muslim Iberia or Al-Andalus, but not post-Reconquista Spain. Somewhat similarly, the term Near East also continues to be used today in the disciplines dealing with the ancient cultures of the region, such as archaeology, Assyriology, and sometimes Egyptology. At some US universities, departments of Near East studies focus only on the ancient Near East, although at other institutions, departments that deal with the ancient to modern periods use the name the Near East as a synonym of the Middle East. Acknowledging the temporal and geographical slipperiness of the term while attempting to erect as wide an umbrella as possible, the Middle East Studies Association of North America defines the term as the area encompassing Iran, Turkey, Afghanistan, Israel, Pakistan, and the countries of the Arab world and their diasporas from the 7th century to modern times. Other regions, including Spain, Southeastern Europe, China, and the former Soviet Union, are also included for the periods in which their territories were parts of the Middle Eastern empires or were under the influence of Middle Eastern civilization. But even this very broad definition manages to leave out pre-Islamic Arab culture, whose poetry is treasured by the Arabs as a touchstone of excellence in the genre and the register of all of their knowledge in the centuries before Islam. So pre-Islamic culture is not covered by this definition, as broad as it is. There have been some recent alternatives, such as West Asia or Southwest Asia and Southwest Asia and North Africa, or SWANA, as the acronym goes. But these remain jargony, and although they avoid the historical baggage of the term Middle East, they do little to change the geopolitics of the region or governmental funding models for area studies programs. Importantly, the people inhabiting the area so designated almost never refer to themselves as Middle Easterners. They may refer to themselves in any number of ways, I mean, by ethnicity as Arabs, Amazighs, Kurds, Armenians, Turks, by religion as Muslims, Christians, Jews, or by sect as Sunnis, Shias, Copts, Maronites, Orthodox, Melkites, Druze, by nationality as Iranians, Iraqis, Syrians, Egyptians, and so on. But they do not use the term Middle East as an identity category, although they may use it to refer to the geopolitics of the region. So, for example, the main Saudi daily newspaper is called simply Ash-Sharq al-Awsat, or the Middle East. Right? So here you see a separation between geopolitics and cultural politics in the partial sort of adoption of the term by the people it designates. And this is one of the many symptoms, of course, of modernity as coloniality. It is not enough, of course, to acknowledge the colonial genealogy of these names given to the two regions, then carry on with business as usual. The task is to decolonize knowledge by investigating and overturning fundamentally Eurocentric concepts, categories, and taxonomies. Labels like the Middle East and Latin America define spheres of colonial influence that have persisted well after the independence of most nation-states in those regions. In that sense, the postcolonial as a geopolitical condition and as a critical category has not brought about a fundamental reorganization of knowledge. In some cases, constructs like the Middle East have been redeployed by some postcolonial critics as self-evident. And such work often depends mostly or entirely on English translations, with little more than token reference to the languages of the region, if at all. This kind of Anglocentric or Francocentric, as the case may be, postcolonialism, may produce gestures of reversal to valorize previously devalued cultures and knowledges through paradigms like mimicry as a form of resistance, writing back as a subversive parody, cultural anthropophagy as national appropriation, and the like, which ultimately remain bounded by colonial epistemology. While they have highlighted questions of power and questioned Eurocentrism, those assertions of agency are necessary, but they are made with Europe as the reference point and as the chief interlocutor. From a methodological perspective, therefore, the focus on South-South relations allows us to move from a postcolonial to a decolonial reading practice that questions the epistemological foundations of comparative and world literature. To illustrate the difference, take the striking example of two critics, one Brazilian and one Moroccan, who did not know each other, but who arrived at the same conclusion. In 1988, in an address delivered at the first Congress of the Brazilian Comparative Literature Association, Antonio Cândido stated that to study Brazilian literature is to study comparative literature. Then in 2004, Moroccan critic Abdel Fattah Quilito said the same thing about Arabic, namely that whoever reads Arabic literature does so comparatively with European texts in mind. Such comparison can be of the colonial or the post-colonial variety. It is colonial when it assumes the universality or excellence of European models. And for both the Brazilian and the Moroccan critic, that means primarily French literature and French taste, assumed to be the standard by which non-European texts are to be evaluated. Alternatively, the comparison can be post-colonial when the objective is to assert the value, autonomy, or even the resistant stance of non-European texts that write back or anthropophagize their European sources. In fact, it is possible to read Quilito's intellectual trajectory as moving from the colonial to the post-colonial positions. In his latest book, في جو من الندم الفكري, published in 2020, the title in English means In a Mood of Intellectual Regret, Quilito describes the effect of colonial education on him, French colonial education, which led him to regard French literature as something above compare, as the incomparable standard, right? The gold standard by which Arabic literature, whereas Arabic literature as something that is beneath compare, that is always measured against the standard of French, right? So here, I mean, of course, the vertical north-south axis of colonial and post-colonial relations dislocates comparison from the cosmopolitan utopianism that has colored the history of the discipline, a discipline that always prides itself on being open-minded and cosmopolitan and so on. As Cândido Quilito and before them, Edouard Glissant knew, comparison in colonial and post-colonial contexts occurs between unequals to the disadvantage of the geopolitically weaker party, as it has been, in fact, within Europe itself. And just look at the fate of Dutch or Scandinavian or modern Italian and Greek or Eastern European literatures. I mean, they really began to appear in the annals of comparative literature just relatively recently and still remain very much in the shadow of the big three. So neither Cândido nor Quilito offers an alternative beyond affirmations of what the former calls o direito à literatura, or the right to literature, an idea that takes universal reason as its horizon, as Stefan Helgesen has demonstrated, without questioning the centrality of French literature and thought, enormously influential both in Morocco and in Brazil, particularly at the University of Sao Paulo, where Cândido spent his career. By contrast, and though also educated in France, Edouard Glissant and Walter Mignolo reject the very idea of comparison, which they see as rooted in the epistemology of modernity as coloniality. So in the Poetics of Relation, Glissant emphasizes that a generalizing universal is always Eurocentric, and on decoloniality, concepts, analytics, praxis, Mignolo and Catherine Walsh echo that idea when they stress that all theories and conceptual frames, including those that originate in Western Europe and the Anglo-United States, can aim at and describe the global, but cannot be other than local. Instead of a theory, therefore, Glissant offers a poetics. And in the place of comparison, which he believes always establishes hierarchy, he proposes relation, capital R, right? Which seeks non-hegemonic connections. For Glissant, a poetics of relation proceeds not vertically, but horizontally, on the model of Deleuze and Guattari's distinction between roots and rhizomes. Glissant argues that rhizomatic thought is the principle behind the poetics of relation, in which each and every identity is extended through a relationship with the other. Rhizomatic thought, in this sense, is non-comparative insofar as it rejects ideas of national identity, national roots, and national languages. For Glissant, comparison is always antagonistic, implicitly or explicitly asserting that my root is the strongest and that a person's worth is determined by his roots or essentially by his language. The sad irony here is that in seeking independence, many colonized peoples accepted this logic, even as they tried to reverse it instead of finding an alternative. So he writes, the conquered are thus forced into a long and painful quest after an identity whose first task will be opposition to the denaturing process introduced by the conqueror, a limitation from the beginning. Decolonization will have done its real work when it goes beyond this limit. That is to say, real decolonization discards the epistemology of coloniality. Mignolo elaborates this thesis specifically in connection with the comparative method, which, as he points out, developed in the 19th century for the consolidation of European identity, both internally, with England, France, and Germany as the heart of Europe, and the countries of Southern and Eastern Europe as its peripheries, and externally against Arabs, Africans, Asians, and indigenous peoples in the colonies. Universality was the linchpin of this process across the humanities and the social sciences, allowing an ideological project to appear objective and scientific as it went about creating hierarchies through comparison and contrast. The invention and universalization of the concept of literature as a component of national culture, distinct from its pre-Romantic meaning in Europe, in Europe itself, as well as from its enormously diverse and non-equivalent counterparts everywhere else, was one of those mechanisms that enabled the creation of a hierarchy of literatures, literatures here, between quotation marks, through comparison. Another related mechanism was in the invention of the ideas of the West and the Orient, and later, of course, the Middle East or Latin America, and so on, which can then be compared and contrasted. Given that one of the purposes of comparison was to differentiate the European from the non-European, decolonial projects, writes Mignolo, are not interested in similarities and differences, but above all in the mechanisms and strategies that within the colonial metrics of power maintain relations and hierarchies between entities, regions, languages, religions, literatures, peoples, knowledges, economies, and the like. Epistemic decolonization involves embracing the geopolitics of knowledge, he writes, and unveiling the processes of how such entities came to be, rather than accepting them as ready-made entities. This idea of decoloniality was, of course, there in the work of many of Glissant's and Mignolo's predecessors, such as Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, Samir Amin, and many others. Said's dismantling of Europe's invention of the Orient exposed its parallel construction of others, right? Political economist Samir Amin called for delinking from the global capitalist system and framed that call within a far-reaching critique of Eurocentrism that remains fundamental to any project of decolonial epistemology. And I'm thinking specifically of his two books called Delinking and the other book, Eurocentrism, both of which really, I think, directly inform Mignolo's and Walsh's call for delinking from colonial epistemology. Césaire's unveiling of the myth of the civilizing mission in Discourse on Colonialism was a decolonial move, even though, of course, he delivered that address directly at the French Parliament, right? As was Fanon's anatomy of the decolonial struggle that, as Sartre observed in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth, are addressed to the colonized. Sartre wrote, it often talks about you, never to you. Right? So with Fanon, there's a triangulation of discourse in which Europe is no longer the interlocutor, as in Césaire and also in Said to a great extent, but the object of an address to brothers and sisters in arms, which is one reason, I think probably the main reason, why Fanon's message resonated with such force throughout the Third World, what used to be called the Third World. Right? Glissant places this aspect of decolonial thought, namely its address to the wretched of the earth, within a clear trajectory of decolonization when he distinguishes between what he calls the invading and era-like nomadism of European colonizers and the circular nomadism that is practiced by Arawak communities who navigated from island to island in the Caribbean, by hired laborers in their pilgrimage from farm to farm, by circus people in their peregrinations from village to village, all of whom are driven by some specific need to move in which daring or aggression plays no part. He further clarifies that the first type, which that is to say linear or arrow-like nomadism, comprises two stages or trajectories. Excuse me. In the first, movement is from the center to the peripheries. And in the second, it makes the trip in the opposite direction, from the peripheries to the center. We could say that both of these trajectories are plotted along a north-south axis. Their paradigmatic texts would be Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, in which, of course, Kurtz and Marlowe go from London to the Congo, and the reversal of that journey in Tayyip Salah's Seasonal Migration to the north, in which the protagonists go from Sudan to London. Right? By contrast, in the third stage that Glissant identifies, the trajectory is abolished. The arrow-like projection becomes curved. And I like to think of the word triangulated, here. So according to Glissant, the poet's words lead from periphery to periphery. That's what he means by curved, right? And this movement produces or reproduces the track of circular nomadism. That is, it makes every periphery into a center. Furthermore, it abolishes the very notion of center and periphery. So for me, this insight is foundational for the self-self dimension of comparative literature. The focus on the self-self axis is one effective way of moving toward decolonial practice. But we need not be bound by the constraints of the poetic image of the circle that contrasts with the linear colonial movement from north to south, or its post-colonial reversal from south to north. Relationality, I'd like to think, need not be summed up in a geometrical form any more than it requires a universal theory. Mignolo and Walsh offer an open-ended framework that they describe in this way. They write, "Our conception and praxis of decoloniality do not pretend to provide global answers or sketch global designs for liberation, even less to propose new abstract universals. We are interested instead in relationality, that is, in the ways that different local histories and embodied conceptions and practices of decoloniality can enter into conversations and build understandings that both cross geopolitical locations and colonial differences and contest the totalizing claims of the political epistemic violence of modernity." To achieve this, their proposal is for creating and illuminating pluriversal and interversal paths, as they describe them, that disturb the totality from which the universal and the global are most often perceived. Emphasis on self-self relations is one way of doing that. I would add that we do not need to discard comparison altogether because it lends itself to hierarchization or because it became a tool of coloniality. First of all, I mean, comparison is much older than the modernity-coloniality formation described by Mignolo and Walsh, and it neither begins with nor is it exhausted by colonial epistemology. Moreover, eliminating it is not an option. As Rita Felsky and Susan Stanford Friedman point out, comparison is a mode of thinking, an analogical mode of human cognition that seems fundamental to human understanding and creativity, and that depends on principles of relation and differentiation. Not just a cornerstone of analytic thought, comparison pervades everyday life as one of the ways in which we organize and make sense of the world around us. Forms of comparison are built into the deep structures of language and constitute the basis for ubiquitous figures of speech, such as metaphor, simile, and analogy. What Glissant rejects in colonial comparison is that colonial comparison upholds the universality of metropolitan norms. But as Hans Saucy puts it, there is the good comparison that acknowledges the other, and the bad comparison that seeks to undo and outdo them. So to be sure, self-self comparison can be of either kind, the good or the bad, in Saucy's terms. It holds the potential for, but does not guarantee, freedom from colonial epistemology, so long as Eurocentric universals go unchallenged. Nor are global self partners necessarily equal in power, something that renders actual relations among them susceptible to hierarchization and domination. The concept of relation, I would like to think, is ample enough to include a reconstructed, non-hierarchical comparison that reveals the entanglements and interpenetrations of what hegemonic comparison construes as distinct and autonomous identities. I emphasize this openness of comparative literature because while we do want to throw out the dirty water of coloniality, we need to preserve the core values of the discipline. What Hugo Melzel called the principle of polyglottism, I mean, the emphasis on the necessity of learning languages, the strong philological and historicist grounding of readings, and the sensitivity to cross-cultural dynamics of literary and cultural exchange. All of these can be put to the service of self-self comparison as a form of decolonial practice. There's nothing in them that is necessarily hegemonic. It bears repeating that while postcolonial studies has consolidated the North-South paradigm in its contestation of colonial hegemony, South-South comparison does not aim to displace the postcolonial, which has obviously had and will continue to have much to offer. Rather, the South-South dimension brings into sharp relief the contours or the limitations of the other paradigms and relativizes their claims. If decolonial practice in comparative literature requires a dismantling of Eurocentrism, we must first become conscious of Eurocentric universals, including such things as the paradigms of comparison we take for granted, the geopolitics of comparison that often go unacknowledged, the construction of comparables and their hegemonic investments that implicitly determine what is and what is not comparable, the criteria of such determinations, the ways in which those relations are ordered, and what such emphases ignore or obscure. Decolonizing knowledge involves the invention of alternative concepts or developing a new way of thinking, as Fanon put it. To do so, it is counterproductive to foreclose any decolonial configuration of existing relations. As such, South-South comparison does not seek to eliminate the North, but to enact a kind of triangulation in which the North is no longer the controlling term. Brazil's most celebrated 20th century novelist, Jorge Amado, illustrates what I mean by saying that the South-South axis is one effective way of moving toward decolonial practice. In 1962, a few years after Bandung, and as though anticipating the tricontinental movement launched in Havana, Cuba 4 years later, Amado wrote the following in his preface to a survey of Arabic literature published in Brazil by Lebanese immigrant Mansour Shalita. Amado wrote, "It is time we turn to those cultural sources that had so much influence on our formation. The attitude of pious admiration for European and North American culture, while continuing to close our eyes to the rest of the world, keeps us in a narrow, provincial, and colonial position. Why should we know everything about France and nothing about Syria or Lebanon? Why be so cultured when it comes to Italy, yet ignorant about Egypt and the new African nations to which we have blood ties? It is time we developed a true cultural policy at this point in our people's struggle for industrialization and development and against economic subjection." End of quote. Amado here, it's very important to notice, does not negate the value of knowing France or Italy, but he questions the colonial and post-colonial assumption that one need not know anything else. Studying the relations among cultures of the global South relativizes or de-universalizes the North, enlarges our horizons, and brings potential allies in the project of decolonizing knowledge closer together. And that's 3 birds with 1 stone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hassan, for this very enlightening lecture, which has given us plenty to think about and to discuss. We're going to start with questions from the panelists and then move on to questions from the audience. Dr. Tabor, can you start with the first question?
Sure. Thank you so much, Waïl, for this very thought-provoking topic that is also very relevant for my research. as someone who is working on South-South comparison, particularly Turkish and Arabic, contemporary Turkish and Arabic science fiction, one question that I've gotten a lot is why? Why are you comparing these two things? What is your justification for comparison? And so I wanted to ask you, how should we establish the grounds of comparison? And when those grounds are constantly moving, especially when we think within the framework of relationality, how do we decide what to compare? Can we compare any literary tradition with anything? And would you say that perhaps the question of like justify your reasons for comparing these two things is itself problematic when we start thinking from within the kind of perspective offered by a relationality and this idea of becoming together?
Yes, thank you. Well, I mean, of course, it's a question about the grounds for comparison, and this is one of the classic questions in comparative literature in general. I mean, even before the postcolonial term, you always ask students to explain the rationale for putting A and B together and talking about them in the same in the same context. So, and in that sense, it's and that continues to be the case, obviously. I mean, but the question now has to do with the new relations that we're looking at. I mean, what is it? What is it that? How can we frame discussions of traditions that are new to the discipline? Okay. I mean, it's one thing to talk about, Romanticism in France and Germany, and even there you still have to kind of identify, common links between specific authors, for instance. But another thing to talk about, an African text, and let's say a Mexican or a Brazilian text, right? So how do you do that? I mean, there's not a general rule. I mean, there has to be some kind of basis, obviously. In my own work, I mean, I was interested in the question of immigration, so that was the link that I found. That was one way of doing, Arab Brazilian comparison, by looking at Arab immigrants and how those immigrants sort of became represented, and how Brazilian writers looked at Arabic, not only Arab immigrants, but also Arab culture, how they read texts like the 1001 War Nights, and how that text circulated. And so there are many different ways of construing that relationship. I mean, if you work in environmental studies and eco-criticism, for example, obviously there's a whole, a range of other relations that one can look at between any parts of the world that manifest themselves in literatures from those regions. I mean, in environmental degradation and how it affects so many aspects of society. So the task of establishing the grounds for comparison is one of the very basic tasks in comparative literature. And that was the case before the recent developments that we've been talking about, colonial and post-colonial studies and South-South approaches, and it will continue to be there as well. This is one of the stable, I think, aspects of the discipline.
Yes, sometimes I feel like when I'm asked to justify my reasons for comparing, there's also a colonial dynamic in that. What I'd just like to share something that I experienced. My first article, I was comparing a science fiction play by Egyptian playwright Tawfiq al-Hakim and the British science fiction author H.G. Wells's Men in the Moon. And my grounds for comparison is that I actually found in one of al-Hakim's writings that he was familiar with H.G. Wells's work, and particularly this text. And then I found similarities between these two texts that I wanted to compare, and some other texts that al-Hakim wrote that were dealing with very similar issues in very similar ways with some of the texts that H.G. Wells had written. So I had valid ground for comparison, particularly because Al-Hakim specifically mentioned this person. And then I got one question in which I was asked why I chose to put Al-Hakim in conversation with H.G. Wells. Was my purpose to get my article published because H.G. Wells was such a popular well-known science fiction author, and this person assumed that Al-Hakim, who is a canonical figure in Arabic literature, was not maybe big enough to actually warrant a publication in a big journal or something like that. So that question of, well, justify your reasoning, actually had that connotation of coloniality for me, that they just assumed that I was putting this text in conversation with the British science fiction text because that's the only way this text could be seen as important and valuable.
Right. Yes, and as I said, I mean that's postcolonial studies set out to kind of make that kind of connection admissible, and through comparing sort of, let's say, an Egyptian author with an English author, right? I mean, that question probably comes from somebody who would not be very much interested in how you would talk about Tawfiq al-Hakim and any, say, Indian or Nigerian author who may be doing something similar, right? But sure, I mean, this is obviously there's still a lot of resistance in various quarters of the discipline to anything beyond Europe. Right? So.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Merve. Thank you for the question. I wanted to bring the discussion further into science fiction territory because it's something that both I and Merve engage. And I mean, first of all, I was really smitten by your recovery of the work of Juan Andrés y Morel in the 18th century European thought, and the sort of how he was forgotten and how he kind of represented the seed of this idea of comparativism that you're bringing forward now. And I mean, we know, for instance, that Borges was one of the people who translated the Buddhist thought into Spanish and sort of brought that culture into circulation in the South environment of Argentina. And recently we have had some examples of science fiction fans in China who are translating works from Latin America and also taking their works to Latin America. So there's a sort of South-South translation network being built there. Right. So I wanted to ask you two questions based on these. First is, how far do you think this can be helpful to the creation of these horizontal networks, these rhizomatic networks that you were talking about? And then how useful could it be for people in the global north to read SF from the global south in translation? So how helpful could that be to sort of help them play a part in the decolonization of these flows of knowledge? And and I mean, you talked about how André's model of world literature shows how the circulation of text, idea forms, and genres has shaped Europe, and also kind of how that it's kind of inevitable for these flows to be hybrid, to be complex, to be confusing.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you. It's, I mean, but I think one thing that the example of Andrés demonstrates is that this circulation of ideas, of texts, has always taken place. It has always been there. It is not the exception, it's really the rule. I mean, the exception was the idea that nationalism introduced of sort of national, coherent national cultures that are, sort of uncontaminated by, or can only be contaminated by outside influences, as the case may be. And the notion that cultures are autonomous, the notion that sort of Europe is autonomous, with no outside influences since the ancient Greeks, who supposedly created themselves out of nothing, ex nihilo, without any contact with, say, Mediterranean or African cultures, or or Asian influences and so on. So that's, that kind of very colonial Eurocentric idea is the exception. Hybridity is the rule. That's the original norm, right? And Andres was actually working within a sort of an episteme which took that for granted. And that's why his example, I think, was so revealing for us today, because we are still living in the post-traumatic era. We've inherited these these assumptions from that period, and only recently that we're trying to wrestle with them and dismantle them. But so this, our era is really the exception in the long history of human interaction, and human culture. And the other thing, of course, which is I would say very unusual, is the sort of the centrality of Europe that imperialism has kind of created, and which, talking about comparative literature or world literature, but Pascal Casanova's The World Republic of Letters becomes an example of, and the argument there that for any author to reach recognition, author coming from the peripheries, they have to be translated into French. They have to be recognized in Paris. Okay, and without that, they just simply don't enter this idea of a world republic. Right? The very notion of a republic as kind of a one coherent polity that has a capital, on the French sort of republican model. That's a very, very Eurocentric notion, but of course, there are mechanisms in place in which make this model quite credible and compelling. The fact that the cultural elites in much of the world, really, and either English educated or French educated, or if not both, the institutions like the Nobel Prize, for example, that sort of confer worldwide legitimacy and canonicity and so on authors, and look at the list of course, all of those who have been recognized with the Nobel Prize. The laureates, most of them, right, are not only European, but a huge proportion of French and German writers and English writers and so on. So these new networks that are emerging now under these conditions, since the middle of the 20th century, out of these non-aligned movement and the tricontinental and so forth. There have been these efforts to foster translation across borders of the global South, to foster direct relations, and now I think there is a movement. It's still feeble, but it's gaining strength. There more than one small press in Brazil today that specialize in translating Arabic literature directly from Arabic into Portuguese. This is not something that existed. Amado was talking about it in 1962 in a way, even though that was just a small volume introducing just kind of a survey of the history of Arabic literature, written in Portuguese, published in Brazil for precisely this reason, to kind of foster knowledge between the two areas. But what he was saying then is still relevant today, and it is being, I would say, put into practice through this publication this movement of translating directly between, say, Arabic and Portuguese, or Spanish or Portuguese, or it's still nowhere near adequate. There's a very, very long way to go, and these are only two languages, and Arabic is only one of the languages that has had or has a legitimate claim, really, for significance in Latin America. I mean, Turkish is another, all the African languages. I mean, all the Japanese, in case, and Chinese. I mean, all the migrants, and of course all the emergent economic networks. I didn't mention the BRICS, and the BRICS that has just expanded itself now by the addition of several new countries, right? So these things are taking place, and they seem to be gathering strength, which is a good thing. And the question for us in literary studies is how do we keep up?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for this. Tehan, can you ask the next question, please?
Yeah. So thank you so much, Professor. And I think it has been like very insightful, and for someone like me who comes from the northeast of India, who comes from like the margins of the margins, I think it's very interesting when you're talking about post-colonial states and the motivations behind comparative literature and these kind of networks and relationality. So I was just wondering if you would like to suggest an alternative or maybe something that could be really helpful for like a lot of marginal communities that are there across the world. I mean, I wouldn't want to specifically mention any, but there are, in fact, like a lot of marginal communities within marginal nations. So what would you suggest, or what do you think is a way out? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, the question of minorities, of course, is very important, and I've spent a very long time working on minorities, and minorities is one of these categories that really challenge the very idea of the nation, and because it's they point to the existence of fault lines and fissures and internal sort of dynamics of marginalization and hegemony and so on. And all at the same time, also minorities in many cases have transnational connections, as in the case of the minorities that I've been working on. I mean, the Arab minorities in the Americas and their relations with the Arab world and so on. So it's something that's I think also challenges a lot of the assumptions of classic comparative literature. If minorities are linguistic minorities, then the national language is not just the national language, and you have multiple languages within the nation. And these language communities, of course, can, oftentimes spill out beyond the borders of the nation. So what is a tradition then? How do you define a tradition? How do you establish grounds for comparison? So minorities unsettle a lot of the basic assumptions on which the discipline was established.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. I think there's not a straight way forward with this, but I really appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Tehan. Thank you, Professor Hassan, for the response. Merve, could you please ask the next question? And for all of you in the audience, if you have any questions, you can use the chat or you can raise your hand and you will be given permission to speak.
Yeah, and for those who are watching on Facebook, you can also write your question on Facebook and we can ask it here. So my next question is about disciplines. So based on this conception of relationality, how do you envision the relationship between disciplines or fields such as area studies, comparative literature, English, and global Anglophone? How can we have more dialogue between these fields? And my understanding is that in order to decolonize comparative literature, the concept of comparison, we also have to move toward interdisciplinarity or transdisciplinarity, and we have to critique the delineation of these different fields. So, what are your thoughts on these disciplinary formations?
Well, I mean, I think you've answered it in a way. I mean, it is. I mean, just as we question the histories, the dominant narratives, the dominant paradigms of one discipline, we also, should be and have been asking questions about disciplinary formations, about the boundaries between disciplines, about the institutional context in which these disciplines emerged. And that's always very important. I mean, there's always a kind of there's a set of interests that govern the emergence of any discipline. There are reasons that are not just purely intellectual, right? And I mean, speaking from where I am, I mean, in the United States, I mean, the country that kind of invented the idea of the area studies in the modern sense, not out of nothing, obviously. I mean, European studies had Orientalism and had, but in the current configuration of area studies, I mean, this was a necessity. I mean, as I mentioned in the article that I sent you, I mean, it was really out of Cold War, necessities that area studies emerged. It was funded by the Department of Defense, Department of Education, in the service of national security. The world was divided into spheres of influence that could then facilitate or mitigate, help policymakers sort of navigate the Cold War, confront Soviet expansion and so on. And these areas emerged, and the emphasis, for example, on all the support that went to particularly not the study of the literatures or the cultures of like, say, Africa or Latin America or the Middle East or what have you, but to the social sciences. I mean, the political scientists, the economists, the sociologists, the anthropologists. I mean, the people whose recommendations could, help policymakers sort of. I mean, at least that's in the vision of those who, established the paradigm of area studies. These were the things they were interested in, much more so than the literature or the music or the and that's why, by contrast, of course, what happened to European literatures is that were also funded, but from a different part of the grant, that saw European culture as worthy of being studied. Comparative literature was funded by, Title IV of the National Defense Education Act, because the cultures of Europe were seen as important to know. The idea was that if the French and the Germans and the Brits and what have you would understand each other's cultures, learn each other's languages, then there would be a reduced risk of having another major world war. At least that's the logic. That's the logic, right? Whereas for the other parts of the world, we just need to learn how to manage them, right? We don't really need to. So that's that. I mean, this is the politics of knowledge, and I would say not just in North America, but everywhere there is a politics of knowledge. There's a logic for the way institutions are built, why certain disciplines are encouraged, funded, and others are, neglected. And this politics of knowledge, which is always local at the same time as it is connected with the outside world. That's why I think the question of geopolitics is so important. The geopolitics of knowledge, but also the institutional context in which academic disciplines emerge in our practice.
Well, thank you, Marvi, for that question. And I'm going to ask the next question. And I think that you bring a very fresh perspective to this sort of effort. to forge a new comparative literature. And I wanted to ask you about the work of Bolivian sociologist Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui. And she uses the concept of chichi, and which reflects the Aymara idea of something that is and is not at the same time. And it's the logic of the included third. And it combines the indigenous world and its opposite without mixing them. And it basically suggests the possibility of governance in our societies should not base in forcing indigenous thought into settler or mestizos notions or of development and state, but rather reformulating and transforming local networks to understand the Chichi reality in which we live, which is this concept of hybridity that you're talking about, which is inescapable. So I wanted to ask you whether you're familiar or not with that sort of mindset, if you think that could be useful in building a sort of new, more geopolitically aware idea of comparative literature.
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with it, and I appreciate your suggestion. I will certainly. I mean, I'll be very interested in reading her work. But I mean, it sounds to me from your description that this is another way of another attempt to think beyond the received paradigms, to think about these other. There's a question of minority there, obviously. There's a question of the epistemology of the the paradigms that we use. There's an attempt to kind of expand the circle or break the circle of universality. So it sounds very promising to me. Yeah.
No, I say that because I mean Cusicanqui has been critical of the tendency in the colonial studies to become a sort of siloed communities in which they sort of perform the idea that things should change, but there's no actual change, right? And then it's sort of to bring new perspectives into this idea of maybe a sort of a logic of the included third, or a parallel coexistence of multiple differences that do not distinguish, but instead antagonize and complement each other. But thank you very much for that response. So far, we have not had any questions from the audience, so I'm going to pass on to Teang to ask the next question.
Yeah, thank you again, Patrick, and thank you, Professor. I mean, you've been really patient with all of us, and I'm really excited to learn more about the comparative literature, because my background is in folklore studies, and then I have like a lot of dissociation, like understanding with just talking about minorities and marginalization. What do you think again would be some form of relationality, or some form of platform, or some way that can bring in some form of acknowledgement for minority communities? I mean, of course, it'll be very contextual depending on the situations. However, if you can just give me a very broad understanding, or however you feel could be helpful.
About bringing the work of minorities to the attention of scholars?
Yes, Professor. And also, like, what do you think is the future for the margins from the very margins? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's it is a challenge as well as an opportunity, as I like to think, to tackle a subject that has not been addressed before. It's a challenge because you don't have much to go on by way of scholarship. You don't have a tradition of scholarship with which you can dialogue. Critics who have done groundwork, people who have, compiled bibliographies, people who have established texts, who have done all of this basic scholarship that then allows us to come and, position ourselves. So that's hard, obviously. I mean, but at the same time, it is liberating, because then it gives you the opportunity to set the framework, to set the questions, to ask the basic questions, which then others can come and engage with. So that's not easy, of course, but as I said, I mean, the absence of a critical tradition or a scholarly tradition gives you that space to establish the framework, to set the terms of the debate, if you like, right? And then, of course, you become the first to address that topic. You become the reference point, and that means that then somebody else will come and engage with your work by way of addressing that particular community or that body of work or that field that you have helped establish, right? So I mean, I think it's a question of how you define a field. Or, how do you define a field for the first time? And that's the challenge. It's an exciting thing intellectually, I think, and it potentially impactful. Much will depend, of course, on how you establish the terms and whether those terms are established in a way that invites dialogue from scholars in other fields. But this is it. This is the challenge that we have to confront.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have a question from the audience. Bushra, could you please go ahead and speak up if you'd like? You can unmute.
Sure. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Waïl, for this talk and for your openness in engaging with questions. I think it's something very important to talk about right now. And first, I'm gonna maybe introduce myself a little bit. I'm also doing my PhD at the University of Oslo in Middle East Studies, and my specialization is Arabic literature and cultural studies. And I'm working on perceptions of race and Blackness in Arabic literature, contemporary Arabic literature. And I'm very concerned with trying to find a discourse to discuss race and Blackness in Arabic and in Arabic literature. And just to go back to the idea of the field and disciplines and all of that. Recently, I was speaking with a mentor of mine, who was also an Arabic literature professor, and he was telling me, what you're doing is not Arabic literature, because the field of Arabic literature kind of ends with the Nahda and doesn't really allow for room to discuss literature later than the Nahda. So contemporary literature is not really considered the belles lettres kind of literature that's to be discussed in the field. And I just I'm thinking about why the field of Arabic literature is maybe not very open to comparative approaches or to more contemporary approaches. And just wanted to hear what you think about that and maybe discuss that a bit with you.
I'm quite surprised to hear that, because the field has, in fact, been, I mean, at least in this country, where I am in the United States, but also in Britain, and I think also in many European countries, modern Arabic literature after the Nahda is a thriving field, and you know, just look at the book lists, look at the publishers that publish. I mean, the University of Edinburgh Press, I mean, you know, perhaps at this point, I mean, the most active, look at their books, the series of the books that they've published in the past decade or so about modern and contemporary Arabic literature. It's an impressive amount. I mean, it's no longer a field that any one scholar can claim to master. It's impossible. I mean, when excuse me, from 2012 to 2017, I edited the Oxford Handbook of Arab Novelistic Traditions, and the idea there was to look only at the novel, the genre of the novel, and with the assumption that the Arabic that it's no longer possible to talk about the Arabic novel as a single formation, but that we have to look, if we really want to understand the phenomenon in its varieties and its breadth, then we have to look at every single Arab country. And even starting with that assumption, to my surprise, once I began to investigate it with the help of a research assistant, I mean, just the amount of primary texts, the amount of scholarship on the novel in every single Arab country. And beyond that, even in sub-Saharan African countries, there are people writing novels in Arabic. So to say that Arabic literature ends with the Nahda is, to me, just untenable. I mean, there are people who believed that 40 years ago, perhaps 50 years ago, and even then it was a reductive view. And certainly today, that's just contradicted by, a brief sort of look at any good academic library and its holdings on studies of modern Arabic literature, and looking at the publishers' lists. I mean, as I have, showed in some of the things I've written before, I mean, even within American comparative literature now, I mean, it's really since the 1990s that you find very serious studies of modern contemporary Arabic literature that are engaging with all the contemporary theories of criticism, almost all major departments now of comparative literature, again in the United States, I mean, have somebody teaching Arabic. So the idea, and most of the time, this is modern Arabic, and it's not only classical Arabic. So I don't agree at all with the notion that the Arabic literary studies have not have stopped by the Nahda.
That's really great to hear. Like, it's great to hear another perspective and kind of engage with that debate. I also wonder if you have anything to say about perceptions of race and Blackness in Arabic literature, and how that the discourse of these notions in Arabic literature, especially because what I'm facing is every time I try to analyze a novel, for example, that discusses that, I find myself having to kind of borrow notions that discuss these ideas in maybe from African American or from African American studies, or from the negritude movement, or
Right.
And I feel like one of the concerns that I have is just trying to establish a discourse or a form of vocabulary that we can talk about race and Blackness within the context of the Middle East,
right,
the Arabic speaking countries, as well as sub-Saharan African countries that are engaged with this legacy as well. So I just wanted to maybe have hear your thoughts about that.
Right. No, that's a very important question, of course. How do you study race and representations of Blackness in modern Arabic literature. Doing so, of course, I mean, there are very developed, studies of that in the North American context, in also in many parts of South America, in Brazilian literature, for instance. I mean, this is a big question. So the challenge here is, of course, I mean, on the one hand, there isn't a tradition in scholarship that has focused on this question. So again, as was Thiang's question, how do you establish that as an avenue of an investigation? At the same time, so you do that, of course, by looking at how race has been studied in other contexts. But then there is a risk. If you only draw on, say, African-American experience and studies of race based on the African-American experience in this country, or the Afro-Brazilian experience, for example, in the case of Brazil, then you're looking at theories that developed to address specific historical contexts. I mean, and that these answers and these theories don't necessarily translate well to another social historical context in which race plays a very different role. All right, may not be as crucial a factor, important nevertheless, because it's there, but not as determining, right? So that's why, I mean, both, Mignolo and Glissant and so forth, I mean, their rejection of the idea of theory and abstract universals would be a warning against the direct borrowing, uncritical borrowing of critical concepts, and critical race theory, for example, from a North American context, and just simply applying them in an Arabic context, because race relations are different, right? I mean, they're completely different. And even if you look at the two biggest countries of the Americas, the United States and Brazil, both of which were built on slavery, and yet racial formations there are very different, very different. So you can't just borrow terms from the United States and use them to talk about Brazil, or vice versa, for that matter. So again, I mean, here there's the, I mean, it's important, I think, to become familiar with all of these discourses, obviously from Negritude on to the present. It's important to study all of this, but at the same time, it is important to develop a set of concepts that are particular to the context that you're interested in, which is modern Arabic. So it's not a quite, I mean, the question of theory is always challenging, because I mean it's one doesn't just take a theory from somewhere and apply it. It's you're reading the theory critically, in an ideal way. Of course, one would be reading the theory critically, right? Allowing the theory itself to be modified by the literature that you're using that you're using the theory to interpret, and vice versa. So the theory is, although many people think that, okay, we have these theories that are applicable and we just take them and use them as critical lenses, but it's important to approach those theories also with a keen eye for their limits. What aspects of them emerge to address specific local conditions in a particular location, and to deal with a particular history, and should therefore become variable, right, and subject to modification when transported elsewhere, and which aspects actually can be useful to dialogue with your local context.
I think Said himself had something to say about traveling concepts, right? He wrote about it.
He wrote about it more than once,
Yeah.
And wrote about it, and then came back and revised his own writing, and so it's not an easy task at all, right? But it's an inevitable task if you don't want to just uncritically apply in a Eurocentric or a US-centric way, which would be completely unhelpful.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Bushra, for your questions. We have one more question from the audience before the end of this session. It comes from Sheena Jane, who has been a very active participant in this series. She asks, please, Professor Hassan, would you say something about the revival of the value of cosmopolitanism away from the somewhat more narrow critique of it in certain forms of Marxist thought?
Well, I mean, it depends on what strand of cosmopolitanism you have in mind, and also because cosmopolitanism is not one. There's a lot of scholarship on cosmopolitanism, which I find interesting, but not particularly useful necessarily for the sorts of things that I'm interested in doing. So I think the notion of cosmopolitanism itself, I think, is again, it depends on what you mean by it, on whose version of cosmopolitanism. And what kind of critique? I think as far as, of course, comparative literature is concerned, when we say cosmopolitanism of the discipline, we're looking at the recognition of the importance of languages, the study of languages, the keen awareness of the centrality of language to all literary creation, to cultural creation, and an awareness and a hospitality, and an openness to that kind of difference, right? Against the assumptions that translation, provides a transparent or unmediated kind of access to others. And in that sense, and that's the kind of cosmopolitanism in its broadest, I think, and most open sense. It's that recognition of the the crucial importance of opening to the other through language, through culture, by not being bounded by our own environment, our own concepts. So that's the sense in which I would be interested in cosmopolitanism, but not beyond, and not much beyond that.
Thank you very much. Yep, Sheena, she responded that she explained that she was talking about cosmopolitanism as elitist versus seeing various forms of it which are subaltern. So sort of a subaltern cosmopolitanism. Wonderful.
Right.
And well, with that, we will conclude this session. I would like to thank you, everyone, especially Professor Hassan, for donating his time and being here, engaged in discussion. To all of you who have participated, asked questions, this will be the last episode of Theory from the Margins under the current formation of people. This has been a collective construction, not only through us who have put in the work in to present these, but also for the people who participated and for those who have graciously agreed to appear here as guests, and to the other people who presented this. So we thank you all, and we hope that you all will carry on with the promise of Theory from the Margins, of building a new forms of knowledge, of, like the example of Professor Hassan, forms of knowledge that have been forgotten that are really important so that we can build a true existence in the world. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you, Mervi, Thiang. Thank you, Bushra, and everyone for your attention and your questions.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Bye.